Welcome to a journey back in time to 18th century Berlin, a city that had not yet earned its place among Europe's great capitals, but was quietly preparing to do so. This presentation uses AI-generated visual reconstructions based on historical maps, engravings, and contemporary accounts to present a visual interpretation of Berlin as it existed during the 1700s. At the beginning of the 18th century, Berlin was not an obvious center of power. It lacked the ancient prestige of Rome, the commercial wealth of Amsterdam, or the cultural authority of Paris. Even within the German lands, it was considered secondary to cities like Vienna or Dresden. Yet Berlin possessed something those cities did not, a state determined to shape its capital deliberately. Berlin stood along the River Spree, a shallow and winding waterway that offered limited commercial advantage. The surrounding land was flat, sandy, and poor in natural resources. There were no mountains to defend it, no deep harbors to enrich it, and no fertile plains to sustain it effortlessly. From a geographical perspective, Berlin should not have thrived. Its survival depended on control. The city emerged from the medieval settlements of Berlin and Köln, twin towns facing one another across the river. These early communities were modest, built around trade crossings and local markets. By the late 1600s, they were joined by newer districts, Friedrichswerder, Dorotheenstadt, and Friedrichstadt, each planned rather than organically grown. This patchwork of settlements formed the foundation of the early modern city. Unlike older European cities, Berlin had few winding medieval streets. Expansion followed plans drawn by administrators, not habits formed over centuries. Streets were laid out deliberately, districts were assigned functions. The city was being organized before it was fully alive. In 1700, Berlin's population stood at approximately 55,000 people. Most residents lived simple lives. Houses were narrow, often shared by multiple families. Construction relied on wood and brick, materials chosen for cost rather than beauty. Fire was a constant threat, and regulations governed how buildings could be constructed and repaired. Public life moved at a measured pace. Markets operated under supervision. Guilds controlled trades tightly, limiting competition but ensuring order. Bells marked the hours, guards patrolled streets. The presence of authority was visible, consistent, and expected. This atmosphere reflected the character of the state that ruled Berlin. The city was the seat of Brandenburg, Prussia, a territory still consolidating its power. In 1701, Elector Frederick the Great crowned himself king in Prussia, elevating Berlin from a regional residence to a royal capital. This transformation was administrative as much as symbolic. Berlin became the center of governance. Ministries expanded, clerks filled offices, records were kept with increasing precision. Unlike courts driven by ceremony and display, Berlin's institutions focused on function. Decisions were documented, systems were reinforced. Military influence was constant. Prussia maintained a large standing army relative to its population, and Berlin served as its administrative and logistical heart. Soldiers were visible throughout the city. Barracks stood near residential quarters. Training grounds occupied open spaces. The rhythms of military life shaped civilian routines. Yet Berlin was not isolated. The city actively welcomed immigrants who could contribute to its development. French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution settled in large numbers, bringing skills in craftsmanship, trade, and manufacturing. Jewish communities, though regulated, played important roles in finance and commerce. Polish laborers and other migrants filled gaps in the workforce. By the middle of the century, nearly one-third of Berlin's population had foreign origins. This diversity did not create disorder. It was managed carefully. Religious tolerance existed not as an abstract principle, but as a practical policy. The state valued productivity above uniform belief. Berlin's early 18th century identity was shaped by this balance. It was not a city driven by passion or spectacle. It did not seek admiration. It sought reliability. Every street, regulation, and institution reflected a belief that society could be organized rationally. This belief would define Berlin's growth throughout the century, and it would soon be tested. To understand Berlin in the 18th century, one must look beyond its institutions and examine how ordinary people lived within the structures imposed upon them. This was a city defined not by spontaneity, but by routine. Daily life followed patterns shaped by regulation, necessity, and the constant presence of authority. For most Berliners, life began early. The majority of the population belonged to the lower and working classes, craftsmen, laborers, servants, and small traders. Their days were structured around daylight and work rather than leisure. Houses were cramped and functional, often built around small courtyards that served multiple families. Privacy was limited, noise was constant, space was shared. There was no running water in private homes. Residents relied on public wells and pumps distributed throughout neighborhoods. Water carriers transported barrels to those who could afford the service. Waste was removed manually, often at night, and strict ordinances governed where refuse could be discarded. Cleanliness was enforced less for comfort than for order and disease control. Food was simple and repetitive. Bread formed the foundation of most meals, accompanied by cabbage, turnips, and rye. Beer was consumed daily as it was safer than untreated water. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or higher-income households. Markets were regulated closely, with prices monitored and quality inspected by officials. Coffee began to gain popularity during the century, especially among urban residents. The Prussian state viewed this trend with suspicion. Coffee houses were seen as places of idle conversation and foreign influence. Attempts were made to restrict consumption through taxation and surveillance, including the employment of informants to report illegal roasting. Despite these efforts, coffee became part of urban life, particularly among the middle classes. Clothing reflected status rather than fashion. Sumptuary laws dictated what materials and styles different social classes could wear. These regulations reinforced hierarchy and discouraged excess. Practicality was valued over ornament. Uniformity was common. Religion, while present, did not dominate daily life as it did in many Catholic cities. Berlin was officially Protestant, yet it practiced a controlled form of religious tolerance. Lutheran churches held a central place, but Calvinists, Catholics, Jews, and other groups were permitted to worship under defined conditions. Religious diversity existed within a framework of supervision. Faith was expected to support discipline, not challenge it. Church services were orderly. Sermons emphasized duty, obedience, and moral conduct. Public displays of religious fervor were discouraged. Unlike cities where festivals and processions filled the streets, Berlin's religious life remained restrained. Social order was reinforced through constant oversight. Guards patrolled neighborhoods. Curfews were enforced. Identification papers were required for movement and employment. Begging was regulated. Vagrancy was punished. The poor were managed through workhouses and charitable institutions designed to control rather than liberate. Yet the city functioned. Crime existed, but it was monitored. Violence was not celebrated. Public punishments were used sparingly, intended more as warnings than spectacles. Authority relied on predictability. Public spaces reflected this mentality. Squares were designed for drilling, markets, and administration rather than celebration. Streets were wide enough for movement and surveillance. Lighting was limited, but regulations governed its use. Night was not a time for freedom, but for caution. Despite this structure, Berlin was not without social interaction. Taverns provided spaces for conversation, though they were monitored. Markets brought together different classes briefly. Festivals occurred, but in muted form. Life was communal out of necessity rather than choice. Women played central roles in household economies. They managed food, water, and childcare. Many worked as servants, vendors, or textile laborers. Their lives were constrained by law and custom, yet essential to the city's function. Legal rights were limited, but informal influence within households and neighborhoods was significant. Children entered work early. Formal education existed, but attendance was inconsistent among the poor. Practical skills were valued over intellectual exploration. Discipline began young. Yet beneath this regulated surface, ideas circulated quietly. Books were printed, pamphlets changed hands. Private discussions took place in homes and small gatherings. Enlightenment thought did not dominate the streets, but it moved steadily through them. Berlin did not resist ideas, it absorbed them carefully. This balance between control and adaptation defined the city's character. Daily life in Berlin was not comfortable, but it was stable. It did not inspire romance, but it offered predictability. And as the century progressed, that predictability would allow Berlin to change without collapsing.